This is from the New Living Translation, Luke 10:25-26. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?"
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to Searching the Sacred. Lisa, Steph, and Jason with you, as always. And we are in the midst of a unique season here for Searching the Sacred, a 40 Orchards podcast, where we are not diving into a different passage and unpacking it and doing a lot of wrestling and dancing and circling and all the fun stuff that we normally do. If you're interested in that, I would highlight the 70 or so episodes before these and go take a listen and a gander at some of those, because we've definitely danced with a number of passages. But this season, we are kind of pulling back a little bit and doing something a little different, where we're kind of asking, well, what is sacred text? Why does it matter? How do you read it? What does it say? Who are you reading it with? What translation are you reading, and why does that matter? And today we're going to kind of continue our dive into what is sacred text and how do we read it by talking a little bit about a big word that some of you may have heard before, some of you may have studied. Others of you, this might be the first time you hear it, but it's the word hermeneutics. And so I'm going to let Steph define hermeneutics to get us started, because I'm sure she's just, chomping at the bit to read some wonderful definition of hermeneutics.
Actually, I'm not chomping at the bit for that, because whenever I hear the word,
Because you're not a horse, and that was really rude of me to
no, I always think of when I started seminary, I was in a distance program early. I mean, this is early to distance programs, you guys. Like, my professors would literally mail a CD of a video to me, because it was before YouTube.
You are old.
I just want to reference what kind of distance program we're talking about. We'd go to campus 4 weeks a year, but there was distance for some of those things. But my first class was hermeneutics. And I just clearly remember freaking out because I didn't know what hermeneutics was. And I was like, what is seminary going to be like if I don't understand the name of the class that I'm taking and I'm about to have a whole class on it? Like, it totally freaked me out. I was like, what have I done? And so I always have that feeling rise up when I hear the word hermeneutics, because I was like, it just scared me as one of my first classes. So it is from the 1670s. It's a Latinized form of the Greek hermeneutikos, which is of or for interpreting. So the word hermeneutics is about how we interpret something. And so it actually isn't only a word for the Bible. It's a word that they use for philosophical interpretation and other interpretations as well. So if we're talking about the Bible, then it's called biblical hermeneutics, which I think technically was the name of my class, was biblical hermeneutics. But then that class is about the art of interpreting the Bible. And what I remember from that class that I think is a good thing for us to talk about is when you all took that class, were you taught more than one biblical hermeneutic, or were you taught a biblical hermeneutic? Because when you look up, I'm going to follow that with thing. If I look up biblical hermeneutics on Wikipedia, it lists a bunch of options. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I was never given options. I was told, this is the biblical hermeneutic. This is the way to interpret, and now put that into practice. And I'm curious if you guys had that experience as well.
No, because we didn't have a hermeneutics class.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, wow.
It was brought up inside of class, but there was not a class on hermeneutics.
I would actually say that yes, my professor I actually took hermeneutics twice, because I started a seminary program distance, similar to what you did, and took biblical hermeneutics. And that class did not transfer over to the school I was working at, where I was going to get my master's of theology. And so I had to retake hermeneutics. And I was really grateful for that, because the first one was a little bit more narrow, like you're talking about, even though I enjoyed the professor. But the second one was more of a historical study of, like, here's different hermeneutical approaches throughout like the centuries and throughout time or through different philosophies of hermeneutics. And so we actually had to kind of dance with things depending on the hermeneutic that we were engaging. And so, like a hermeneutic of suspicion was obviously very foreign to me, but also kind of fun. And so, yeah, there was some introduction to different hermeneutic styles or approaches.
Interesting. So I was really, and I could be remembering it wrong, but I remember being taught that the main thing was the concept of exegesis. So that's
Hmm.
another big word. And exegesis is the idea of drawing out, is what it means. So it's the idea of drawing out from the passage instead of Jesus going into the passage. And I just don't remember being exposed to anything other than that concept as a way to interpret scripture. And then it was like fleshing out what it means to practice good, solid exegesis. Um, what I see, like again, just even on the Wikipedia page, is it lists that in biblical hermeneutics, you can have literal, moral, allegorical, or anagogical. There you go. Approaches. Anagogical is mystical interpretation, apparently. Um, and I was like, I don't remember thinking about that. I don't, and it's interesting to me to think about this. So part of why we're having this discussion, I think, is people don't. I think we don't step back very often from the books we're reading, from the pastors we're listening to, from the podcasts we're listening to say how does the way that person was trained affect how they're approaching scripture, and therefore the kind of scriptural interpretation I'm exposed to or not exposed to based
So
on this
let me
unspoken thing.
let me play listener for a minute and kind of throw some questions at you and give me like the kind of quick answer or like a quickish answer. So exegesis. If I'm an exegetical preacher, if I'm an exegetical pastor, exegetical podcaster, what am I doing? Like, what's the MO of a person that practices exegesis? Because that word itself is one of those words, like, if you were to take a class and it would be like exegesis of the Bible, you might be like, I don't even understand the title, right? Similar to hermeneutics. Okay, so give me what is an exegetical pastor doing?
It's a good question. Well, because I'm thinking like it's going to vary denomination to denomination, I think. Um, but in general, if I were, let's say a pastor is reading a letter from Paul, generally what exegesis would teach you is read the historical background of that letter and the geography to the place where that letter is written so that you know something about the context.
So you want to know
In
who Paul is writing to, what's
mhm.
been going on in the history of that location that might impact why Paul is writing that letter. Okay, so that's part of it. What else?
So then the way in theory, then the way that you let it speak for itself and you draw out is you then knowing that context that helps you quote unquote understand the meaning that Paul intended. And then
Hmm.
you can explain the meaning that Paul intended because you've done that research on the context. And then you draw out from the meaning Paul intended to that place and time what it means for us and what the three applications for our lives should be.
Which, like, okay, so let me play with this a little bit. So, like, the alternative to that is Paul writes a letter in the first century to a group in Corinth, and I don't really care anything about the people in Corinth. I don't care about the history of Corinth. I don't care about what they were going through or what struggles they were having. All I know is that Paul said X, Y, and Z, and that applies to my life directly because I'm experiencing like hardship, or I'm experiencing love, or I'm experiencing alienation, or whatever I may be struggling with. And Paul seems to be writing directly to me. And so I would venture to say that taking into consideration the history, the place, authorship, audience is at least a little bit better than just Paul wrote in the first century to Jason in 2025.
Mhm.
I mean, I think
Yes, and
I would offer that one of the things that exegesis assumes is that you can get to the original meaning
Okay.
by
There we go.
understanding the context, like that we actually know what the context is, and because we know the context, we can therefore interpret this is what it would mean.
Mhm.
Like there's a way to like get to that intended initial original thing.
Right.
I don't know that I buy that, but I just
Mhm.
You know, so when you say, "I don't know that I buy that," meaning what? You don't know if we can actually get there?
I think sometimes it's easy. I think sometimes it's pretty easy to like follow along and get there. And then I think there are lots of times where it is not that easy. And you can see trying like people really trying to like grasp or get to the context. And it's important to remember that we don't always know all of the context.
Yeah.
Or we can assume. So like like I'll just pull it like modern day. I think there's like two things that there was this meme that came up that I was like, this is a brilliant meme to explain some of this stuff. That like in 200 years, if somebody is reading a quote about a booty call or a butt dial,
Yeah.
it'll be really hard to know the difference. And
Yeah.
even with context, it may be very hard to know the difference of what the hell we're talking about. Because it could be that somebody is looking back at our culture and going, they were just really messing with cell phones. They were really into those things. So it's definitely butt dial. And somebody else could say, well, they were a hypersexualized like community. So like for sure they're talking about a booty call. Like, so depending on where you land in looking at that particular context, and the context really depends on the individual person. Like, I exist in those communities, but which one am I more likely to use? And our language is always evolving. Like,
Yeah.
like giving, if you have kids,
Mhm.
you know that like all of a sudden they'll come home and say something, and you're like, what the hell does that mean? Or like, now we like
Oh my gosh, Gen Z
Google,
slang
what is this?
changes so much.
It's super
And
fast.
they don't even know what it means. I'll ask them. I'll ask my kids, like, "What does that mean?" They're like, "I don't know, but it's what people say."
I'll say.
Like, okay.
So I think that's what we're swimming in, is the
Yeah.
soup of like
Mhm.
assuming that we know the culture that Paul existed in because we have some data points, but we actually don't have Paul explaining what he was saying. We just
Mhm.
have him saying what he said.
I
Yeah.
think that's and I wonder if this what we need to say is this is the definition of a more evangelical exegesis, is to assume we can get to that original intent. And some of the other traditions are not assuming that. Like if you like midrash, which is what we tend to practice here, is technically a form of exegesis. It's a form of drawing something out from the text, but your questions, your assumptions are really different for what you're trying to draw out. And in that context that Lisa was saying, there's just a lot of assumptions about being able to get to the original meaning. There's also a false assumption, I would add, of being able to disconnect from our own biased perspective as we're doing that. So there's the problem of the booty call butt dial like context thing.
Exactly.
But there's also the problem of how am I and my own in that same circumstance, how will my views on sexuality affect how I read that? Because they will. I cannot escape my own perspective no matter how hard I try. And in this particular form of exegesis that's saying, let's get to the original intent, assumes that I'm neutral.
Hmm.
And even to the point where like, the kind of the process that my professor kind of took us through was like you read some of that history, you do some work in the passage on your own, and then you read a few commentaries. So like you don't read the commentaries first because then you're not being biased by the commentaries. But then you read a few commentaries, and if you disagreed with the commentaries, you're the one who's wrong because people have been studying the Bible too long for you as a seminary student to have a novel perspective. So then do your work to line up with the commentaries that you read because they're more studied than you. And I think and then those commentaries that we were reading
Probably
were from a very narrow perspective of
I was
white
gonna say
male
the list of
professor.
commentaries is very narrow. You're not going to be getting commentaries from a very wide range of people and experience.
Right. And so like one of the things that we do now is we often in 40 Orchards will say, like, what do womanist theologians say about this passage? What do liberation theologians say about this passage? Because our guard is we assume we can't take our perspective out, and we shouldn't. So let's intentionally read a wide scope of perspectives on the same text as a way to ask better questions of the text.
And
That's not evangelical exegesis. It's something
but
different.
let's be clear. It's other people doing exegesis as well. It's not a womanist feeling on the passage. It's a womanist exegesis of the passage. So they're still doing similar work, but with a different lens through which they're doing that work. And so you're still trying to understand the culture. You're still trying to understand what's going on, and like I think there's also a key component here of it depends on where we are in the Bible, right? Some parts of the Bible were written with the intention of this being wrestled with. Other parts of it were informative letter. Like we're talking about Paul's letters. Well, were we supposed to midrash those? I mean, we can, but like Paul was writing to a community that he was trying to help. Like, so I mean, not that you can't do a little dance with Paul, but Paul was writing for a specific reason. Whereas like a prophet is doing something a little different. And the way we exegete or the way we dance is going to be a little different.
That goes back to your pushback or your question of like, is it bad to spend time in that historical thing? Like, no, that's good. We want our pastors, we want our faith leaders to say, what type of literature is this?
Yeah.
What was that historical context? Where is this in the timeline? That is actually good, helpful work. But there's a way I think sometimes we do the kind of thing that convinces us that we're being more academic than we are, or we're being more unbiased than we are. Like I remember being with a group of people that were all seminary trained, and after the conversation, someone came up to me and said, it wasn't until today that I realized I have never read or been exposed to a Jewish commentary on the Old Testament.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, that's a problem. Right? And like why don't we, what are we afraid of in how we train people in terms of exposing them to those different perspectives and how those perspectives might belong? There's like an obsession for Christians to only hear from Christians, or Lisa's got a thought on this already.
Well, I think it's the balance, right? Because you hear like exegesis is good, eisegesis is bad. Like exegesis.
Okay, define eisegesis. What is that?
It's like pulling your thoughts into it and making the text like what you want it to be, which is what people get accused of when you have a different thought. You're not. And I feel like growing up, this is not to say there are not good evangelical exegetical work. Like I'm not trying to like make everything good bad, but growing up, what exegesis feels resonant to me because it was the way that I can't trust myself. You don't know. You can't trust yourself. It's not about your feels. It is, this is what the text says. This is what it is. Deal with it. And that's how I like, that's what I like. So like, I just learned and I believed that people knew what the text said. That somehow somebody has, like, they've gone to seminary, they've done the work, they know what this says. And I'm going to trust them to interpret for me because I can't possibly know because I haven't done that. And I can't trust if my brain is like, that doesn't sound like God. Like, does that Jesus really say that? And so like, there's a little bit of like, you got to shut that off to stay in that exegete, like for me. And it still gets framed as like one or the other when I actually think most people are doing both at the same time. Like, I don't think you can pull out your own perspective and what you are doing with the text or what it might be saying to you. And it doesn't mean that you can't continue to wrestle, but I think that's an initial, like, I think about like the story of the woman at the well. And there's a narrative inside of that talks about her having multiple divorces. Now, for me, that reminds me of my parents. My parents had multiple divorces. I can't step outside of that being a lived reality. Like, as soon as I hear it, I'm like, my parents are now they're
Hmm.
in it with me. And if I stop, like, if I just keep it there and I just keep it, I miss this other part of the story, which is a woman who actually has no autonomy to get divorced.
Mm.
Like, I need to actually have a little bit more of I need to have more context. I need to have a better understanding of what's happening to help
Right.
open up that story.
Because ancient divorce was different than modern divorce.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
can't help but read divorce in my context because that's what I have.
Right.
My understanding of that word and the process is going to vary depending on like what we've seen in our lived experiences. And so
Right.
like there's just it's like it's all kinds of nuance, but I have to do both things become
Hmm.
a part of the conversation instead
Right.
of it being
And
like polar opposites.
Right.
and I think that we actually get a better sermon from you if it's personal like that. Like, and there's like, why have we felt like we have to take that out completely as compared to balance that? And how do people think? Like, I wanted to stay in that story for a minute because I've heard so many sermons on anything related to Samaria that think they have done the work of context and that exegetical work of historical context by there's the assumption. If you like, listener, think about this right now. How do you think about Samaria? Because probably you've heard pastor after pastor say something like the Samaritans were like the ugly outcasts of the Jewish people. Something like that. Like nobody liked the Samaritans. Like think about however that was framed for you. And then because that's been said enough, we think we know the context. And there's lots of pastors who just keep repeating the thing that other pastors have said about Samaria. And they feel like they know the historical context without actually thinking more deeply about that historical context or recognizing the hints of anti-Semitism that are in that context of this people group othered that people group. Okay, but then what are you saying about the people group who's doing the othering? Like, how do you hold that a little bit more? And the historical complexity that has really been enlightened to me in the last few years is rating from the person I talk about the most, Amy Jill Levine, um, about recognizing that when the Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom split, way back in the Hebrew scriptures, which is also the historical context for the New Testament. Like people miss going back to the Hebrew scriptures as a historical context for the New Testament. In the Hebrew scriptures, the Northern Kingdom started a civil war with the Southern Kingdom because they did not want a Davidic king anymore. The Northern Kingdoms are the ones that caused the split. The Northern Kingdom under Ahab had its capital in Samaria. So if you think of like all of those narratives about King Ahab and and Elijah and all of that stuff, Samaria is the capital. This is a long held historic split amongst people who are meant to be the same people group.
Cousins. Yeah.
But cousins, yeah. It's not these are the outcasts, these are the poor people, it is like, how do you re-engage after years and years of animosity? That's a different historical context than I've heard in most sermons. And the power had gone back and forth between which one was then the oppressed versus oppressor sort of power. There were times where it was either, but the whole time there was friction to the point where Samaritans actually have their own Torah. By the time of Jesus, they actually believe that the capital was never in Jerusalem. They tell a different historical reality where the capital was always in Samaria, and that the Northern Kingdom was the group that was right. They have their own. The first 5 books of the Samaritan Bible are different. And there is a Samaritan Bible. Did you know there's a Samaritan Bible?
Not until today.
Right? And so even when we think we're looking at history, most of the time we're not. When we
Well,
think
because
about
it would be really difficult. And like, very honestly, it's very difficult to actually get to, I would, I would argue it's almost impossible to get to the truth because for every time you can find a commentary or a statement on this is what was happening, you probably can find another perspective that would say, no, this is what's happening. Because it just depends. It depends on where you come from. It depends on what you have access to, what you've read. And And it's a lot of work. It's a ton of
Well,
work to like read through things, because like how history is held, who's telling the story, like it just takes a lot of time to work some of these things out. It's why you can't. I, I both understand why people are trying to like read the Bible in a year, but I would also say that's, if you're doing that, then you should also have a year where you're just researching something else to help continue to like give you some balance in like what you're understanding, because there's so much going on underneath that. I mean, just to know like, wait, who is king, who is doing what, like the Older Testament and in the New Testament, even to understand Paul. Good gravy, like that guy writes in a crazy way that I still sometimes I'm like, what is he trying to say? Because there's a lot happening for a letter.
and I think this whole conversation is important because we're diving into some of the details of exegesis and eisegesis and hermeneutics and all the historical context. And your question, Lisa, of like, can we ever really know all of it? Like, it's so much, and it's so long ago, and it's been dealt with so much, right? Like, there's so much written on all of this. And that's where, like, one of the questions that I think gets asked in hermeneutic, like, classes and other areas is, okay, well, what is the bigger story that this is a part of? And because, okay, we might not be able to get to all the answers that you want, right? Exactly who were the Samaritans? Exactly who was Paul writing to? Exactly where in Paul's life was he writing from that may have influenced his mood in that moment to write the way he did? Like, we may not have all of those details or be able to figure it all out, but what we can have is a overarching meta narrative that helps give us a little bit of grounding as we go about this work. So, like, if all of your research ends up being, man, Jesus was really, really, you know, hateful. Okay, well, really, like, okay, maybe you are reading it wrong in that case, right? Or like, because the bigger meta narrative is that Jesus is the embodiment of a loving God who created humanity out of goodness and not out of evil, and is renewing the whole thing and wants it all to flourish. Like, that's my meta narrative, right? That's a part of my meta narrative. And so if the scriptures don't line up with a meta narrative of created good, have some tension, moving all towards flourishing, well, then maybe there is something off about like what work I'm doing. So I think hermeneutics can help us with the bigger meta narrative of what we're talking about as well.
If the meta narrative set up by the hermeneutics we've been exposed to lines up with who God actually is.
Yeah, and that's a big if.
And that's
Because
a
there's
big
a lot of
if.
meta narratives out there. Yeah.
And I think the other thing, like when we're thinking about something like Paul's letters, I feel like it is the minority of Christian contexts that have also considered the fact that Paul was a Pharisee as a part of the context of Paul to say Hebrew scriptures really, really matter for those meta narratives. And there's a lot of Christians who've been like, the Old Testament's extra, or like framed it. There's like an angry God of the Old Testament and a gracious God of the New Testament. Well, that's not a good meta narrative.
No.
But it's often because we're only looking at the New Testament. We're not looking at the arc of the whole story and how it's the same God interacting with humans in different ways over time.
Right.
That affects how we read it, if that's true or not, or if we just read like, oh, New Testament's totally different. And then I'm just really,
If that were the case, Old Testament God angry, New Testament God grace, what Paul does would have been the most miraculous thing in human history, to be a part of that tradition and then come up with grace and love. It would have been crazy for Jesus to be respected by anyone in the tradition when he was on the planet, because he is the fulfillment of the law, not the aberration to the law. And like, there were plenty of Pharisees and scribes and teachers who ended up becoming disciples and following Jesus. And so they wouldn't have done that if it was, no, we believe in vengeance and hateful and angry God. Like, what do you do in loving your enemies? I mean, no, it's because it's been resonant the whole time, right? And It's just, do you have eyes to see and ears to hear?
It reminds me of a thing that we reference that we could put in our show notes. But in some of our groups, we'll talk about Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg has a really compelling idea that Jesus was a Pharisee. And she has written a series of 3 posts about it. Like, that's why he's talking to them so much, because he is calling out his own group and he behaves like a Pharisee. And I think that really, I just feel like that'd be shocking for most Christians to consider, because of how much we don't realize it's been set up as a New Testament versus Old Testament, Jesus versus the Pharisees, as compared to one meta narrative of a loving God. Like, I feel like people's reaction to that post shows something about the meta narratives they've been given.
Okay.
And where they're not ready to reconsider them.
This is great, because 3 different approaches. 1, Jesus is a Pharisee talking to his own people. That's a historical context. That's an exegesis. That's a hermeneutic that may make us read the text in a unique way. Option number 2, when we approach Scripture, who do we identify with? If we understand the historical context, if we understand what's really going on, we would realize that most of Christianity in the Western world is actually Pharisaical, not the marginalized, oppressed people that Jesus is helping all the time. We're actually the people in power. We're actually the ones controlling the narrative. And so if you do good historical work, good exegesis, you actually realize, oh, Jesus is coming at me, and I need to be willing to receive that. Like, woe to me. Like, be careful. But if you don't do either of those things, you're often left with, Jesus is here for the marginalized. Well, I want Jesus to be here for me, so I must be the marginalized. Regardless of any circumstance in my life right now, Jesus is here to support me, because what else would Jesus be doing? There's no way Jesus would critique me. There's no Jesus would challenge me, because Jesus is just here to love me. And so if I remove all that historical context and I just want Jesus in my life, well, then I don't have to question anything. I just have to make sure that I pray enough or go to church enough, and then Jesus will be on my side, and all the good things that happened will come my way. And so doing some good historical contextual work allows for us to experience the Scriptures in a unique way or in a different way.
I think that the reason that has not happened more goes back to what Lisa was saying about, I learned from the sermons I was listening to, I learned that I couldn't trust my own voice.
Mm.
So to notice that the way things, when pastors have interpreted us as being the disciples versus us as being the Pharisees, that benefits the pastor. If the pastor is a Pharisee, that doesn't benefit the pastor. Now the pastor's got to do some work on themselves and maybe give up some of their power or change how they're doing things. And so to recognize that the religious leaders that are in power right now, in any way, including us, we all have power right now through what we're doing. It benefits people in power to not do what you just said.
100%.
I lose power. If I hear Jesus talking to me as a Pharisee, I lose power. I have to be more humble. I have to do all the things he was saying that to do, versus if I am one of the marginalized people, then I just get a pat on the back. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah. If you want something to grow, find an enemy. Make yourself the victim and the hero all at the same time. And people will be attracted to that, because it's much easier to have a joint enemy and to feel a joint victimhood and to be our own hero than it is to be critiqued and challenged and pushed and responsible. Those are harder human concepts. And the Bible is actually incredibly good at challenging those things.
I think it'd be helpful to end with some questions for listeners to consider as they wrestle with this for themselves. Like, what is this? What does all of this mean for how I read the Bible? What do I do with exegetical work myself? What do I do with hermeneutics myself? How does this affect my quiet time? If someone still has something called like a quote unquote quiet time, like what do I do with it? What are my practices? What are my questions? The first thing that comes to mind for me is the value of doing biblical work in community. This is a little bit biased for my for 40 Orchards, but I'm biased towards it because I believe in it. Is that part of this hermeneutic we've been talking about is a pastor by themselves, digging into all of this context, digging all these commentaries. And when you're by yourself, it's harder for you to see your own biases. When you read the Bible with other people and actually talk about how do you hear this? How are you reading this? Like our Luke verse that we're talking about, then we can hear our own bias more quickly just through hearing another voice in the room. So that's one practice I would recommend, is just be with other people more often when you are looking at anything in the scripture.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the practice of just writing down some questions that I have without the other things. So most of us, if we're going to pop into the Bible, we're not like going back and looking things up, but I would be curious if we're asking questions and thinking about it. So reading whatever passage you're reading, like just having, what are your questions about it? Get curious. If you could ask anything, what would you ask? Like, would you want to know, like, who is this being written towards? Like, when was this written? How do we know that why is this in the Bible? How did it, like, whatever the questions are, whatever things like bubble up as you're reading something, or if you're frustrated with it, like name the frustration. Just put those things down in terms of like thinking, because it helps reveal some of your own perspectives, but it also can help you get a spot to like go look for something different. Because I would imagine that most of us would actually want to go look for an answer, look for something. With, I would say, the caution of sometimes we go to texts because they're like, I feel sad. I want to feel comforted. I want to find the passages that make me feel comforted. Well, you've set yourself up now for a particular reading. Maybe you've been told it's this. It might be super comforting. That's okay. But that you might be reading something completely out of context. And so that can also be a place to like, if you want to go do it, it's a good place to do it. And if you are looking for a particular thing and you want comfort, that you just have to acknowledge that that's what you want. And so you're not actually interested in all the other things. You just want to hear something that feels comforting. I think just being honest with yourself and what you're looking for in the text is a good spot to start.
Which also helps people trust themselves again. Like maybe spend some time reflecting on, have I really been implicitly taught to not trust my own perspective on a text, to not trust my questions, to listen to what other people have said? And what if my gut might be right about some things? But if I have some good questions to ask that I was told not to ask, how do I trust those things? I'm going to add one more because Jason talked about those meta narratives. And I think in the act of wrestling, the work of anchoring to something while asking questions can be helpful. And it pushes a little bit on this idea of exegesis, because it could be considered eisegesis to do this. But it also helps us ask some of those questions differently. So if I anchor to something like, God is loving, and the whole of the scripture tells me God is loving, how then do I read this passage where God doesn't seem loving? That different questions come up if I anchor to something like that. Whereas like if I'm gonna have, I can't let go of the idea that God is loving. Therefore, I will anchor to that meta narrative as I wrestle with all of the texts and ask the questions that keep that anchor in focus, and wonder about the possibilities.
It makes me think of one more thing. I don't know if this is going to be helpful or not, but it reminds me of, I think I was always taught that Jesus is like throughout the whole Bible. So when I would read things, I would always read Jesus into the story. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that's what I was taught, and recognizing that's what I was taught. So,
Mhm.
so sometimes wondering, well, is that the context that was written in? Is that what somebody was saying? Because there is an entire different religion based on some of those texts that would not agree with that. And does it have to be like right or wrong?
Mm.
Can we leave room for different ways of seeing things, but understand that I'm doing a particular thing? When I am saying, "Well, no, Jesus pops up. Jesus is there in the text here." A friend gave me a book that had like that. That's all it did, was tell me
Mhm.
where Jesus was hidden in the Older Testament. There's a particular way that they're doing that, but I have to recognize that that's a particular thing that they're doing.
Mhm.
Is
Mhm.
that what I want to do with it, or how do I want to come into the text?
It's like you're asking the question, what's in the text and how do you read it?
Mm.
Let's
Mm.
let's let's keep asking that.
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical text so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40, that's 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by Les FM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.